we hear a lot of rants from authors who are not pleased the way it goes, and I've always wondered, you know, how much they grasped the idea that it was a different medium, or whether they were just kind of outraged that their book turned out differently than
what they had in their head.
well, that, or maybe in some cases they actually change. I mean, I don't know. I wish that I had time to be more up to date on movies than I do, but my life seems to be sunk into books at the moment, so I'm really not all that current on, you know, on how well novels like Anna's are matching other things, because I don't get time to watch them.
Well, there are two different animals, two different necessities. You know, film and TV and film have different requirements than writing a novel, and authors need to understand that. It's easy for me to say because I've never heard anything butchered by someone else. I think I'd be pretty outraged, but you know, they say you need to just throw your book over the Rockies and forget about it.
Well, it'll be interesting to see, should either of your books translate into a movie, you know, how that dynamic may or may not change for you. Certainly Be the One, which we'll get to in a bit, I think has the potential for being a wonderful movie. Lots of action in it, and you know, the kinds of things that I would think would be relatively hot topics at the moment in film. I had some other question that had just come to my mind, which I am blank. Is there a significant difference between doing a feature movie and something for television? I'm sure episodic TV, clearly, but if you're doing a movie for television as opposed to a movie for the screen, what differences are there?
Well, there are lots of differences. The medium is different. Obviously, in television, you are writing 2 commercial breaks. In a TV movie, there are 7 commercial breaks, or what we call 7 acts. So you learn to write to a peak of action in order for the viewer to come back, obviously. Now, that's been good for me in terms of learning how to write books and write crime novels. One of the things reviewers praise about Be the One is that it is a page-turner, and people stay up all night, and spouses fight with each other about who's going to get the book because you keep turning the pages. Well, that is something it took me a long time to learn how to do, from the necessity of structure in television. In features, you don't have that imperative because the audience has paid their money, they're sitting in a theater, and usually they're not going anywhere. So you can be leisurely, you can be indulgent, you can be too long, which I think is the case in 98% of features today. And there's a 3-act structure. You're not required to have as much story, as much development.
Sure.
So I grew up with a lot of development, and that's what's in my novels. But in terms of writing features, you also have more freedom. You don't have network standards and practices. You don't have censorship. You don't have sponsors that, you know, might get utsy about things. You're not on the public airwaves if you're on network TV. You have more freedom in cable, obviously. And you have more money to spend in a feature. So you can have better everything. Better actors, better locations, bigger scale of stuff.
Well, the time, I presume that you can vary the time in a feature film, whereas, as you point out, in television, it's like writing a newsletter. I have to cut my copy to fit the actual.
That's right.
I'd rather write for my website because then I don't have to be disciplined. It can just go on forever. But you're absolutely right. In forcing it to work for the medium, it does. The bits that get chopped out often turn out to be superfluous, and it ends up being a better document.
Yes.
And
yes.
I think what you were saying about, you know, writing for commercial breaks, the story has to keep cresting.
Yes.
You know, to keep everybody interested. That sort of wonderful page-turning deal that can go south if you don't have that in mind, if you're just wandering through a book or a feature film.
Right, and I think that that's what's lacking in a lot of fiction these days, is it becomes lackadaisical. Sometimes the payoff doesn't work. It sort of peters out. But writing for television is like writing for a newspaper. It's a daily demand. You have to perform. You know, you can't check out and say, well, I couldn't figure that out. You have to figure it out.
Very true. In fact, the best books are the books that have an end as good as their beginning.
Yes.
And unfortunately, and I agree with you, there are a number of books that have come out in the last several years where the setup is good, and then we get to the middle and it just kind of sags, and the ending is often a terrible disappointment. I've never been totally clear whether it was because the author ran out of time or because setting up a book is easier than finishing it, and as long as they got to the middle, the theory would be that the reader as you say with the film, you know, they're in the middle of the movie. Unless they're, you know, really unhappy, they're probably not going to walk out on you.
Right.
And it may also be a philosophy in some of these books that, you know, if you can get the reader carried into the middle of the story, they're probably going to go on or not ask for their money back.
Yeah.
And then it can be a disappointment. And I have had a lot of customers complain, you know, that they were very much let down with the ending of a book. So I see your point that this has all probably been wonderful training for you to think about getting to the end and making it as strong as your setup.
Yes.
So what inspired you? I was appalled to realize just a few minutes ago, looking at it, that North of Montana, your first book, came out in 1994. Seems to me like it was just a couple of years ago, but that's a long gap. But what prompted you to write a novel?
In the first place?
In the first place, right.
Well, actually, it came out of the writer's strike of 1988. I'm talking about the Writers Guild of America, which went on strike for a long time. And my husband and I were in business together in television. We had a production company. We had a lot of things in development. And basically, the strike took the rug out from under our feet financially, emotionally. And we just decided to go back to our roots. And I, of course, had trained at Stanford in the creative writing program and hadn't written prose in a long time. Television was a kind of a diversion. And my husband, Douglas, went back and got his degree in poetry at Warren Wilson College. And we just said the heck with it. We took an enormous risk. I wrote North of Montana totally on spec. Didn't even tell people I was writing it. And my theory was I had a story that I felt was very strong, and I was going to tell that story and write it in my own way without network interference, and that's all I cared about. And I did. It took 5 years, very stressful years. I did television in between just to keep going, but I would do 6 months on TV and then 6 months on the book. And then, of course, it all had a joyful and happy ending. You know, it sold in less than 24 hours. It was kind of a bidding war, and it's everybody's dream.
Very true.
Yeah.
But of course, most first novels are written on spec, aren't they? That's not that unusual.
Maybe not in the world of novels, but in the world of TV, you're always on assignment. So in order, you know, you just gave that up and said, I'm not doing that.
Sure. In the world of fiction, most often a first novel, because New York is increasingly turning into Hollywood,
yes.
There are more books being bought by people with credentials, not necessarily writing credentials, but professional credentials. The theory being that they're going to write what they know and the book is going to turn out well, or presumably they'll be a script doctor or a ghostwriter or something. But typically, and as a publisher myself, I can tell you this is how it works, a book is written by an author, a first novel,
Right.
and submitted to you. And
Right.
if that works, then after that, that whole system of a proposal from the author and a payment of an advance so that the author can then do the work comes into play. But I think everybody feels they have to be satisfied that the author can actually write a book.
Good point.
And what I found difficult as a novice editor, and it may make some sense to you having spent 5 years on your book, the most difficult part of getting a book when it's completed from a new author is they are so in love with it and they work so hard on it that the parts that aren't right or the places that you would like them to do it differently are just really hard for them to let go. And I have had the experience of really struggling with 2 first novelists last year and producing books I thought were okay but not as wonderful as they could have been. And this year, because they are writing them to design, and I've had a chance to talk to them about the structure and whatever it is, they're actually writing much, much better books. And I didn't expect that for some reason. I didn't realize how hard it would be. Would that have been true for you if somebody had bought North of Montana and said to you, this is great, but this whole subplot doesn't work or whatever?
Well, I'll tell you about that. When my agent called me, first of all, I went to New York, and there were 2 agents who were interested in North of Montana. And I met both of them, and I chose one, Molly Friedrich. And